Good morning, American Histories. It's time to put your banjos down and start learning history again. We're going to start by doing some rehashing and trying to put World War II into some bigger world history context. You have to remember that World War I was the biggest event of the 20th century so far, and the world has been changing. If we go back to the age of exploration, the countries that were best at building ships became the most powerful countries, starting with Portugal, then Spain, then France, and then England. They just dominated the world and built world empires because they were best at building ships. Then the country that was bestest at building ships became the most dominant country, which was England, who wins the 7 Years' War against France in 1763 and dominates the world with their empire. This rocks everything. England becomes dominating countries like America, who rebels, and then they shifted toward Australia, and they especially started dominating China, where they fought their opium wars in the early 1800s, which destabilizes China and actually leads to where we're going with World War II. World War I breaks out in 1914, and in the bigger context, it's a clash of those old countries who are good at building ships, England and France, versus the new countries who are good at building machines. The Industrial Revolution just changes and destabilizes the entirety of the world too. The old shipbuilding countries like Spain and France, they have actually declined. England adjusted to industrialism, so they had an empire and they remained powerful. The new industrial countries need things in World War I. Germany has emerged as the greatest industrial machine on the planet by World War I. America had demonstrated immense capacity for industry, and we had turned aggressive to gain more of an empire like England. We attacked Spain in 1898 to carry out that old Mahan thesis of gas station islands, which puts us on islands across the Pacific, which is our bubble expanding across the Pacific if you look at your Pacific map. And if our bubble is expanding and Japan's bubble is expanding, then those two bubbles are just bound to clash eventually. So World War I, in many ways, represents this clash of the old age of exploration countries versus the new industrial countries. And the way it ends does not stabilize the world. As we said 1,000 times in class, half the German army held back the entire army of England, the entire army of France, and 40 other countries helping England and France. And the war just drags on for 4 years in the trenches until America becomes involved, which does not doom Germany to failure. It just means that Germany can't win the war. A peace treaty is signed with really no clear victor in the war, leaving Germany that feeling of they could have won, which is going to lead to wanting a rematch. So we're trying to build this bigger context of World War I was old countries versus new countries, and ends in a very destabilized manner with the Treaty of Versailles. Then the world is hit by the Great Depression, which did nothing to stabilize anything. Germany suffered the most from the Great Depression. America suffered greatly from the Great Depression. And countries turn to their leaders during times of crisis. That is pretty evident right now during our current situation. Leaders were unable to deal with the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover goes down as one of the worst presidents in American history because he just couldn't deal with the Great Depression very effectively, and it led to that Roosevelt Revolution, the New Deal, and how government's going to be more involved in the economy forever after. We can definitely see that in our current situation today. The American government gains power from the Great Depression. FDR is the great example of that. He's the only president to serve more than 2 terms. That was never a law before FDR. George Washington set a precedent and walked away after 2 terms to set the idea that no man should have that much power to serve more than 2 terms. He could have been president for life, of course, going back to the very beginning of the year, but he chose to step down. The world situation is so extreme by 1940 due to the fallout of World War I and the Great Depression and the coming of World War II that FDR changes that entire situation and goes for a third and then a fourth term as president, which is symbolic of how the people were turning to world leaders in the Great Depression and giving them more power to try to relieve their miseries of the Great Depression. That's just one example. The Russians turned to Joseph Stalin, who becomes the most extreme dictator in Russian history, maybe the most extreme dictator in history, kills 40, 50 million of his own people during the 20s, 30s, and 40s and early 50s to try to stabilize Russia in his own way. The Japanese turned to Tojo, a military leader, to lead them out of their misery. The Germans will ultimately turn to Hitler. The Italians turn to Mussolini. Every country, because of the Great Depression, has turned into more powerful governments. Those more powerful governments, in turn, realized that one way to stimulate the economy through the Keynesian economics that Roosevelt was using is to build up their militaries. Japan builds up their military, Germany builds up their military despite the Treaty of Versailles. England and France don't do anything about it because they're still rocking off balance from World War I. They believe that destroying military is the way to keep the peace, but it's not stimulating their economy. So Hitler, especially in Germany, puts his economy back in balance through building up the military, which is a great example of the people are giving governments more power. The ultimate problem with this is once you give your government the power to build the military, they're going to use it. So the Great Depression is followed by more military aggression during the 1930s. This is the same presentation on your screen, so if you can't see this clearly, just follow along on your own screen. And you might have to adjust the volume because the recording area here is not that great for this type of recording. So, the real context of World War II, the real place to start, despite everything we've sort of learned in society, is not with Adolf Hitler. The real place to start looking at World War II is with Japan, who invades China in 1931 for the reasons that we just discussed. It was the Great Depression. The world economy was suffering. Japan has been wanting to expand their bubble. If you apply some of the history we've learned in the past, during the Age of Exploration, Japan realized quickly that European explorers would dominate them, just the way European explorers dominated China from the 1600s through the 1800s. Japan realized this is not healthy for their own view of the world. Japan sees themselves as superior to everybody else. They literally see themselves as the land of the rising sun. This is where the sun starts every day. Every Asian country sees themselves as superior to all other countries. And so they saw bad things happen to China. They saw bad things happening around them when the Europeans came and tried to change their culture to a Christian culture, to a European culture, and tried to force their cultures on Asian countries. So Japan shuts it all down in 1600, kicks every European out of Japan under the pain of death, which leads to Japan being isolated for about 253 years. They missed the entire Industrial Revolution. And so when Matthew Perry shows up in 1853 and introduces American industry to Japan, Japan realizes they've missed out. We forced them into trade, but Japan gets all the advantages of that trade. The whole story of Japan is just really amazing. Their people are truly amazing. By 1905, Japan is caught up with the rest of the world. I think we've discussed all this before. I'm just trying to give you a bigger context. By 1905, Japan's caught up to the rest of the world to the point where they defeat the Russians in a war, which is just ridiculous. Hopefully you have your map of the Pacific out by this point, and you can see little tiny Japan compared to giant Russia is just a ridiculous mismatch, and yet the Japanese are able to destroy Russia. It says a lot about the culture and dedication and power of Japan. It also tells us how weak Russia has gotten by 1905 with their terrible absolute monarchy and sticking to the Tsarist system and never really embracing the Industrial Revolution until it's too late during World War I. So Japan is even more powerful. Their bubble is rising. They adopt the Mahan thesis and they start wanting islands in the Pacific after 1905 so they expand their trade, industrialize, and get richer. Their biggest problem is a complete lack of resources in that tiny island, which leads to really the starting point of World War II. If Japan wants to truly expand their bubble, they want to be an industrial giant like England and America and Germany have become, they must have resources. And if you reference your map again, their nearest neighbor is China. And China's been getting weaker and weaker and weaker throughout the age of exploration. China started off as a grand, original river valley civilization, but England and foreign countries have sliced up China and just kicked China down. England literally forced China to buy opium during the Opium Wars in the early 1800s. Germany and Japan and other countries just sliced China up like a pie and took little trading pieces, which just destabilizes China to the point of the empire system collapsed in China. They toyed with democracy in the early 1900s, which leads to the leadership of a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, who sees himself as the leader of democracy in China, but he's also the leader of corruption in China. He took any money he could get to enrich himself and make he and his family members rich and leave the poor of China to just get poor. What could classically be described as the rich getting rich while the poor get poor. But this led to a communist revolution in China in the 1920s and 1930s, where the poor leader, Mao Zedong, literally rose up from the nothingness of his life in southern China, and he builds a communist party from nothing and actually sees himself as the true communist leader of the world. The whole thing wasn't really working out in Russia the way communists planned. So Mao sees himself as the truest communist in the world, which is me planting seeds for things to come later in Korea and Vietnam. And Mao and Chiang Kai-shek begin a civil war in China in the 1920s, 1930s, which hungers Japan. Japan sees an opportunity of, we need resources, China's divided, we should attack China while they're weak and destroying each other. And so Japan invaded China as early in 1931, and the war escalates as the 1930s go on. And there's a lot of significance to what's going on here in Japan and China. Here's the three big points that you really just need to get out of this little video about Japan starting World War II. Japan's a small island with very few natural resources. They attack China to try to get natural resources. If they can get the oil and the rubber and steel they need, they won't depend on America anymore for those resources. Then they can expand their industrial and trading bubble out in the Pacific. The ultimate problem there is America has taken those Mahan Islands in the Pacific. We own the Philippines, we own Guam, Wake, Midway, Hawaii. We have a string of islands all across the Pacific we use for trading purposes, those old Mahan thesis gas station islands. If Japan wants to expand their bubble, they have to take those islands, which means America and Japan were just doomed from the beginning to fight some type of war. Japan needs the resources first. The problem with attacking China is China has, even at that point, almost 1 billion people. China's actually a bigger country than America is. They're the third largest country in the world, and we are the fourth. Plus they have just this immense population. And so, much to Japan's surprise, Mao Zedong, the communist revolutionary, and Chiang Kai-shek, the corrupt nationalist symbol of democracy in China, they join forces to defend China, which basically means China can soak up all the Japanese bullets and just drain Japan of resources. This drags on for 10 years. Our starting point was 1931, and if the Chinese drag this war out for 10 years, that takes us straight to 1941, which is a key point. Just call this key point number one. By 1941, Japan is so desperate, they also bomb Pearl Harbor. And this explains why they bombed Pearl Harbor and how they bombed Pearl Harbor. by 1941, Japan's been at war for 10 years. They started with very few resources, and they've been draining those resources into a war against China. As that escalates and it looks more and more like America is going to get involved, they start worrying if all our resources are being drained to China and America gets involved, we don't have the snowball's chance in the microwave of winning this war. And so that is why they chose in 1941 to make that surprise punch in the back of the head of America. It was meant to knock us out of the war before we're in the war, to let them finish off China, take the French Indochina area labeled your map, which is rubber plantations under the French Empire, eventually make their way down to Australia in the bigger context. By that point, Hitler is pounding England into the dirt. He's already conquered France, so Japan can have Indochina, and they don't believe England has really a chance of defending Australia as long as America is knocked out of the war. So, the point here, big point number one, resources, resources, resources. Japan is small, they're draining their resources from 1931 to 1941, then they punch America. So, as long as it's a short war, Japan has a chance. If it's a long war, America will drain Japan of their resources, and this will put into context later some of the things we do. Point number two, there's a series of pictures in this piece of the presentation that are very, very, very harsh. They're on your presentation. If you did the Socrative and you're doing your reading, you've already seen them, but I just want to explain why we point out this harshness of Japan versus China. Japan absolutely brutalizes the Chinese. We learn a ton in school about the Holocaust and how terrific or how horrific it was, which is absolutely true. But we oftentimes don't focus on how brutal the war between Japan and China was, and how just absolutely brutal the Japanese were in World War II. That's important to understand for a couple of reasons. One, it'll change our way of fighting World War II. The Japanese were horrifying to American soldiers. The Japanese specifically targeted the medics because their calculation was if you kill the American medics with red crosses on their helmets, then more Americans die for lack of medical attention. The Japanese, due to their truly historic culture, but more because the World War II leaders Japan twisted the historic culture, they just did not see surrender as an honorable thing, so they treated prisoners of war just horrifically. Some of you have probably seen the movie Unbroken. You would have read the book Unbroken in your CP3 English class if we were moving forward. Not sure how to go for you. But it gives you an idea of how brutal the Japanese treated our prisoners of war. And ultimately they reached a point of so desperate in World War II, they ate American prisoners of war. In fact, they were so desperate they were eating each other. In places like New Guinea, where there was absolutely no food supply toward the end of the war, Japanese platoons of soldiers would draw straws on a daily basis to see which of their comrades would be eaten for supper that day. They were brutal in World War II. In some ways it was desperation, in some ways it was just the twisted samurai culture their leaders of World War II thrust upon them. So some of our decisions in World War II against Japan was to end the war as quickly as possible. We were also brutal in World War II. There was a great little news summary I shared on March 8th was the anniversary of the firebombing of Tokyo. With our regular bombs, we were killing 100,000 people a night in Tokyo. Our position was the sooner the war is over, the sooner everyone stops dying. Now, the reason to go into depth on this big point number two, everybody knows how we ended World War II. We used 2 atomic bombs. We're the only country on Earth to ever use atomic bombs in battle, and we did it twice. And we still take a lot of criticism for that. The Europeans in particular, every German foreign exchange student I've ever had has been just radically against us ever using the atomic bomb. And they were definitely a horrifying weapon, but Harry Truman's point of using them was if we end the war quickly, then more lives are saved, whether it's American, Japanese, or any of the poor people caught between this Titanic of a war. So the reason to understand this Japanese brutality is to understand why we use the atomic bombs. We will come back to number 3, but let's take a quick look at the pictures here. These are on your presentation. You've seen them all already, but this is literally Japanese soldiers here in the middle, they are practicing cutting Chinese heads off just for the sheer sake of practicing cutting off heads. The leaders of Japan had twisted that ancient and proud samurai culture into the idea that every good Japanese soldier needs to be able to cut off a head with one clean stroke. Your generation believes you created the selfie, but look at these guys back here. This guy's photobombing with a giant smile on his face. He's so proud of his friend about to chop off a Chinese head just for the sheer sake of practicing chopping off heads. Or this one, which is a ditch full of massacred bodies in China. This one is particularly disturbing. These are Chinese civilians who have been machine gunned to death. The Japanese didn't focus on just military targets. They truly believed the Chinese were an inferior people to them, and all of them should just simply die, which gets real scary close to Hitler's theories on race too. Let's take a minute and not look at that one yet. Let's go back to the beginning, actually. We missed this guy. During basic training in any military, you will have bayonet practice. If you go through American basic training, they'll use sandbags to help you practice bayonet training. This is a Chinese guy tied to a pole, and these guys are bayonet practicing on this poor Chinese fellow. They're learning how to use their bayonets on a live target because, remember, Japan is short on resources. Using Chinese civilians as bayonet practice was cheaper than buying sandbags for bayonet practice in Japanese. Gives you a real good idea of how horrifying the war in the Pacific was. And the most terrifying picture of all. I can't linger on this one very long because it is so disturbing. Japanese soldiers in China would literally take babies by the feet, fling them in the air, and try to catch them on their bayonets. Japan was absolutely ruthless in World War II, and there were worse things than this that I might have told you in class, but I will not actually say on a video. You can ask me later if you need a discussion forum topic. So, this violence, the killing of literally millions of Chinese people, is how we will justify using the atomic bombs to save lives later. And the end-all point of this little video giving context to World War II and why we started with Japan. Most people thoroughly believe that Hitler was the cause of World War II. And I will radically diverge from that thesis. Hitler was a horrible human being, not justifying Hitler, not defending Hitler. But he does not go to war until 1939 when he invades Poland. That is a solid 8 years after Japan starts abusing China. Definitely several years after the ramped up abuse of China, which began about 1935, 1936. Hitler was in power by 1935, 1936. He saw in the news, in the newspapers, on the news reels, what Japan was getting away with in China. And he asked himself several questions. What was anybody doing about it? And the answer is, nobody was doing anything about it. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles created the League of Nations, which is supposed to prevent war. It was supposed to be a chance for people to talk out war. The League of Nations wagged their finger at Japan and said, you stop doing that to China, and Japan simply said no and quit the League of Nations. At that point, it would have been the League of Nations' responsibility to go to war to defend China. But the idea after World War I was nobody wanted to go to war again. England and France and the League literally passed a resolution declaring war illegal. So how do you stop a country who starts a war? The only recourse is to actually go to war. League of Nations not willing to go to war to save China, which leaves the world leaders of the League of Nations, England and France. They were bled white by World War I. 1/3 of all Scottish men died in World War I. There is no way England and France are willing to go to war again to defend China from Japan. In their mind, it was a bunch of Asians killing Asians and not worthy of white Europeans going off to war to save China. In addition to that, England and France are also suffering from the Great Depression. They're weak from World War One. They're broke from the Great Depression. They're not going to war to defend China, which leaves America. America is in the midst of the Great Depression. Plus, remember, we vowed isolationism after World War One. So there's just no way we were going to war to save China. So what would Hitler learn from all of this? As long as you go to war against a people that nobody cares about, who are considered racially inferior to white Europeans, as long as you pick on a group that nobody cares about, you'll absolutely get away with it without the League of Nations, without England, without France, without America interfering. To jump ahead a little bit, just to give you an idea of where this is going, clearly this opens the door for Hitler to abuse the Jews, but it also opens the door to Hitler's master plan. Hitler's master plan was never to conquer the world. There is no evidence whatsoever in any of his writings or the historical research about the Nazis and Hitler. Never wanted to conquer the world. Wanted to conquer the Russians, who he considered racially inferior, and they had the Lebensraum, the elbow room living space, to create his master race. They had the farmland. His goal was not to conquer the world. His goal was to conquer the western portions of Russia, the Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world, which is where you can grow food there to feed his master race. Hitler believed in breeding and creating this master race for his Third Reich of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans. As wrong as the genetics there may be, he truly believed in it because people just didn't know any better at the time. He believed the perfect German blonde-haired, blue-eyed people should grow up on farms, get away from the dirty industrial cities. He believed country life was the best life, that blonde-haired, blue-eyed men and women should be matched up, raise 10 children on farms. If you grow up on a farm, you become physically strong, you work hard, but you also become mentally strong because you must overcome all problems independently on the farm. And he didn't even really advocate in Mein Kampf the killing of the lesser people such as Jews or the Russians. He just believed they should be put in the bigger industrial cities and they can breathe the dirty, smoggy, coal-ridden air and do all the industrial work while what he called the good Germans were growing up on healthy farm living. And so in his mind, to attack Russia would actually be doing England and France a favor. The Russians were considered behind, they were considered backwards, and keep this in mind, Russia stabbed England, France, and America in the back during World War I. Russia goes communist, which defies every bit of our culture in America, where we put money and God first. The communists don't believe in money nor God. Then the Russians withdraw from World War I, leaving it a one-front war to fight the entire German army on one front, which makes it harder on England, France, and America to win World War I. That's in fact why they don't outright win World War I. They don't militarily just destroy the Germans. It's why World War I's left hanging in that limbo of no clear, absolute victor. So in Hitler's mind, as long as he picks on the Russians, he would actually be doing America, England, and France a favor. He did not believe anybody would go to war over the Russians, just like nobody went to war to save the Chinese. The problem is the country between Germany and Russia, which was Poland, created from the Treaty of Versailles. Also in Hitler's mind, a nation that nobody would defend, people that were often considered lesser than the rest of the Europeans. And that's where we shall leave you in suspense. Have fun with that.